The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. This is Chuck Callio from the IBM Z Systems Business Development Team. I am a business development manager for core banking, and we're very, very fortunate today to have two industry experts to talk about the very timely topic of core banking modernization. Just as a reminder, this is part one of a two-part series. The second part of this webinar series is on July 11th, and we'd love to have you attend both. I will run the charts through this and introduce our speakers. There'll be plenty of opportunity for live questions and answers. The first part one will feature Jerry Silva, who is a vice president of the financial industry at IDC, and Bala, who is the CTO of Zafin. We're very, very fortunate to have two industry experts on core banking, and I love talking to both Jerry and Bala around core banking modernization. Part two in July will focus more around the how, and that's where you'll hear from Bala. So let me just give a brief introduction of the speakers today. Our primary speaker, our guest speaker, is Jerry Silva. Jerry's the Vice President of Financial Insights at IDC. And Jerry is very knowledgeable and an industry expert around core banking and the timely topic around modernization. And Jerry will take you through the IDC findings around core banking, the why and the what, pretty much today. We're also very, very fortunate to have, from a practitioner standpoint, the CTO of Zafin, and that's Bala, and myself. So without further ado, I'll just cover some logistics. Typical questions are, will a replay be available? Absolutely. The second thing is, will the charts be available? Absolutely. And the third thing is, if you'd like to reach out for individual consultation, you see my email there, you see Bala's email there, and at the end, Bala will show you an email ID you can reach out. We're going to offer individual consultations one-on-one, and that can be anything from a couple hours of discussion to you just want a few other questions answered. So we're very, very flexible, and we look forward to this. So let's get down to business. We'll now have Jerry start. And so Jerry, I will go to your next chart. You can start, and you could just sort of prompt me, next chart, please, would be fantastic.
Thanks, Chuck. Good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining us. Appreciate your time. Just a little bit about myself. I've been with IDC for about 9 years now, I think 9 years next month, but I've been in the industry for about 36 years. Half of that time actually spent as a technology buyer at 3 or 4 different banks, none of which exist any longer, hopefully not because of me. And I've worked in both operations, IT, and line of business for a number of large retail banks. So today, as Chuck mentioned, I'm going to be talking a little bit about core modernization, some of the ancillary technologies like AI and analytics that go along with it, some approaches that we've seen. It's really a simplified kind of presentation. Happy to take questions on any level of detail that you want to get into. I used to have a CEO at the bank where I worked who, when we would give him a presentation, and back then it was on paper, he would immediately go to the last page for the answers. He didn't want the whole story, he just wanted the answers. So here are the answers, essentially. Why are we doing all of this? What are the priorities coming out of the pandemic for banking? And this is worldwide. Customer experience and satisfaction was the #1 priority for most of the institutions that we've been surveying for the last couple of years. So that's going to drive both the line of business as well as the IT agenda going forward. Absolute focus on customer experience and satisfaction, for a number of reasons that I'll go into. Innovation, depending on the survey, it keeps popping up and down between the #2 priority, the #4 priority, and so forth. But absolutely key, it keeps coming up time and time again. That's another focus area as well. That has to be enabled by the modernization that we're talking about today, and that in turn is going to drive or improve the focus on the customer. And then finally, one of the biggest issues that we saw during 2020 in a lot of our systems was around resiliency and scalability, particularly around areas like small business lending that were absolutely hammered in terms of the number of applications that were coming in. As branches closed, banks were counting on the fact that their customers would go to the digital channels when in fact they started calling the contact center. And so there were a lot of misplaced kinds of feelings about what the customer behavior would be like during the pandemic. And clearly the customer contact center, they themselves had to move to a work from home situation. So the functionality wasn't always there, the security wasn't always there, the scale wasn't always there. So there are a number of reasons during 2020 that forced the banks to focus more on resiliency, scalability, and so forth. And we'll talk about some of these things. Chuck, next slide. And so, this is one of the surveys. We've been running surveys at IDC every 6 weeks or so since the end of the pandemic. During the pandemic, we were running them every 2 weeks. And so this is from the latest survey in February of 2022. I believe I've got the April survey, but we haven't gone through that data yet. But you can see here, it's emphasized that customer satisfaction clearly is the #1 priority. Here, the question was, what were your top 3 business priorities post-pandemic? And so 38% of the banks, more than any other percentage, shows customer satisfaction as one of their top 3. If you look at the rest of them, there's a significant gap between that and, for example, operational efficiency, profits, and so forth. Some of these surveys have actually shown us that innovation was even more important, depending on I think the last one was in December, that said that innovation was even higher a priority than operational efficiency or profits. But you can see customer satisfaction is driving, and this is going to be driving investments in multiple areas. In AI, for example, I'll show you later on how important that has become and how that's driving technology investments at the institution. So I won't read the rest of these, but you can see this is where the priorities are going forward for retail banks worldwide. Next slide, please. So what's driving the modernization to what we call the digital infrastructure? And I'll explain what we mean by digital infrastructure at IDC in a couple of slides. So as I mentioned, many applications experienced challenges in scalability and resiliency during 2020. And they were in specific areas, things like contact center, things like lending for both small business, consumer, and corporate as well. So these are things that we are trying to catch up on. Skill sets. So as we're modernizing to, again, what we call the digital infrastructure, skill sets, particularly at the medium to smaller institutions, are not keeping up. I think you've seen that. I was just reading a number of stories as travel has started again, and I've been on the road quite a bit. You're seeing that staff shortage everywhere. Compound that with the fact that we have brand new technologies that we're looking at, whether that's Open API, microservices, Kubernetes, whatever it happens to be. There are key skill sets, even in AI, for example, AI developers, data scientists. Unless you're a very large institution, you're going to have problems finding and keeping those people. Real time. It's funny, 5 years ago when we were talking about core modernization specifically, I always thought the real time was kind of a lame excuse for conducting a core modernization exercise. However, that's changed with things like real-time payments, with things like fintech, with the increasing importance of getting that loan origination decision as quickly as possible. So real time is absolutely rising in terms of importance, particularly when it comes to core modernization. And then one of the things we've learned as some functionality has been moving to cloud is that the ISV market, those independent software vendors, are really driving a lot of the movement toward cloud. In our surveys, again, when we ask institutions, why are you moving to cloud for certain functionalities, what they're telling us is that that's where the functionalities happen to be, from these smaller fintechs or from lending ISVs, for example. So that ISV market is really driving some of that workload out to cloud as well, whether it's private cloud or public cloud. That tends to be where they're developing their platforms. Next slide. So this is what IDC is now calling the digital infrastructure. If you think about it, again, I used to work in operations for an institution, and I was responsible for a data center for L2, L3 support at a data center. And it was all within the walls of our data center. And we weren't that large of an institution. I think at the time we were about a $9 billion institution here in Massachusetts. It was all within the walls of our data center, whether it was the mainframe, the server farm. We had, if you remember, tandem computers that were driving our ATM networks and our payment switches. So all of that was contained within the walls of our data center. And then we had, links going out to the partners, whether it was Visa, MasterCard, whoever else driving the ATM networks. That has now changed considerably. Now CIOs and the IT organizations have to think about their infrastructure being expanded beyond the walls of their on-premise data center. Because now you're talking about everything that you have currently within the data center, again, mainframe or server farm, whatever you have there, and you're probably dealing, depending on the size of the institution, with one or more cloud providers. And then you're dealing perhaps with third-party partners that are doing either authentication services for you, KYC compliance as a service, or some other third-party partner that you're working with. The networks, the security structures and security platforms in place, all the way out to the edge. This is now the banking infrastructure. It's no longer controlled necessarily within the on-premise data center. It's expanded beyond that, including what is in your data center. And so this is about ubiquitous deployment. It's about autonomous operations and about cloud native technology working together. And if you see those boxes at the very bottom, we're not making a distinction about what goes where. This is compute anywhere. This is storage anywhere, network, cloud where it makes sense, all the way out to the edge. And then not forgetting management and lifecycle. You know, I talked earlier about the skill sets necessary to support modernization. One of the scary parts of this digital infrastructure is you now have a need to do management at a couple of different levels. First of all, how am I tracking resiliency? Am I monitoring the applications? If I get a phone call from my customers saying that the mobile banking app is lagging or it's crashed, can I, as an IT organization, pinpoint where that is? Was it a problem at the edge? Is there a problem with the network? Is there a problem with the third-party provider? Is it within my own data center? Is it a data problem, either on-premise or at a partner? So managing it from an IT perspective has gotten tremendously more complex. It allows you to do a lot of cool stuff, right? This is the basis of innovation, but now you're forced to manage this at an IT level and then at a governance level as well. So what are the privacy issues like? Am I complying to local regulations? So this digital infrastructure is meant to be open, it's meant to be innovative, it's meant to be real time, but there are challenges associated with it when it comes to the management and the governance of this kind of an infrastructure. Next slide. And so this is what I'm talking about here in terms of that digital infrastructure. On-premise, you still have the mainframe and what IDC calls a transformative mainframe, where the mainframe is now evolved and advanced to the point where it can support private cloud, it can support workloads. It's still very reliable, it's bulletproof. You have your server farms within the on-premise environment as well and everything that goes with that. And then depending again on the institution, you're going to have one or more cloud partners, whether it's AWS, Azure, IBM, GCP, Oracle, whoever you have. And then you've got the third-party partners that I talked about. This again could be authentication as a service, KYC compliance as a service, it could be a managed service that you have a relationship with a third party, and then all the way out to the edge. The important thing to note here is it's not just about the compute, it's also about the data. And when I start talking about AI and analytics later on, you'll see how important it is to manage that data. Kind of as a preview, one of the slides that I don't show here, one of the results of our AI survey last year, and the new AI survey, by the way, is coming out, I think, in 2 or 3 months from IDC, is that the biggest challenge, the biggest single challenge to implementing AI-based analytics is data management. As an industry, banking still hasn't figured out how to de-silo all of these data sources. And so you really need to pay attention to where is the data, where do I need the data, how am I going to be running analytics against that data? And again, is the data resilient, is it scalable, and so forth. So again, this is the picture of the digital infrastructure that I showed you before, but this is a little more detailed. Next slide, Chuck. So, Chuck mentioned the 4 W's, and I'm kind of cheating here. It's actually 3 W's and an H, but I put the W at the end here. So this is, the why, what, who, and how to do core modernization. Now, this is, admittedly very simplistic. It's a very simplistic look at things. So the why, I think I've kind of talked about the why. Modern core banking systems, they enable greater agility, resiliency, scalability, real-time, faster innovation. Again, the architecture is changing. We are moving toward that kind of an open API, microservices-based environment, which ultimately will improve customer experience. One of the surveys, again, that we've run in the past, where we asked about the real benefits from modernization of the core, the number one benefit that we saw was improved customer satisfaction or improve customer experience. In fact, modernization, when I look at that survey question, the top 3 answers had nothing to do with IT. They were improved customer experience, improved innovation, faster time to market for new products and services. So that's really the why. It's no longer the case of, should I or shouldn't I? Now you're kind of forced to do core modernization to some extent. So what does core modernization actually mean? It means replacing or modernizing certain applications, workloads, or functionalities with the newest versions using modern development tools, modern architectures running on a digital infrastructure. So taking that picture of the digital infrastructure in mind and saying to myself, okay, I have a mobile banking app. That app is not a single monolithic thing. It's now comprised of multiple services, microservices, or parts of the application. It may involve external providers again, maybe for authentication as a service. So even the app itself, even what we used to call mobile banking, is now kind of a digital infrastructure version of it, where there are multiple pieces of it running in different places throughout the organization or throughout that infrastructure. Who is involved? This is kind of an obvious one. Really, everyone at the institution is going to be impacted by core modernization. It starts with the C-suite. The C-suite really has to commit to wanting to be a new, what we call a digital business now. And by the way, here I'm going to, this is my own personal feeling as a recovering banker. I tend to be that kind of a get off my lawn kind of banker. When I hear banks say that they are actually technology companies that do banking, it makes me want to pull every penny I have out of that bank. Banks really should be focusing on banking and let the technology folks, the technology partners, take care of the technology side. So the C-suite, though, has to commit on saying, yes, we want to be a digital business. And then IT and operations has to follow that with, well, we acknowledge that we have to move toward this digital infrastructure and create as open and as agile and as resilient and scalable an infrastructure as we can. And then that drives down into the line of business as well. Now they have more opportunities to develop new products, new services. We're talking now about possibly having business analysts creating and composing applications instead of going back to an IT developer and saying, can you build this for me? And then waiting a year before it takes place. So the entire organization is really impacted by this. And then how? I'm going to show you in a second here the different approaches that banks are using. And they really fall into three major categories that I'll detail on the next slide. But depending on the institution, depending on the risk appetite, depending on your legacy environment, you're going to take a different approach depending on those kinds of criteria. I actually spoke a couple of weeks back to a large regional bank in the Midwest here in the US, and where I thought they would have taken one tact in terms of modernizing their core, they actually took a completely different one, which kind of blew me away. But I'll mention that on the next slide. So Chuck, please, next slide. And we'll talk about these three approaches. Now, again, this is very simplistic. Depending on the institution, you may take a hybrid approach depending on all of these. So the big bang is what we've always called, rip and replace. That's, you have an existing core banking system, and you're going to get rid of the whole thing, build another one next to it, and then over the time period of a weekend, maybe cut over all your data files to it, all your customer files, all your product files, and so forth, and then start fresh Monday morning with that brand new core system. Now, this is still suitable for a number of banks, particularly very small banks, particularly banks who have, for example, a managed services provider that it's kind of easy. The end of the contract is there. Maybe you're not happy. Maybe you want functionality that's only provided by another managed services provider, and you do that kind of a weekend cutover. It's very simple product portfolios and so forth. This is where that major bank in the Midwest, who I would have thought would not have chosen this because of the risk. If this doesn't work Monday morning, you can't open the bank. And yet they chose this approach. They chose that big bang approach that said, yeah, we're going to take the entire core and modernize it over a weekend, which really surprised me. But it happened to be successful for them. So, or the other kind of bank that tends to look at this approach is banks that have, even larger banks that have homegrown core banking systems where it's really difficult to try to progressively modernize or to try to move functionality over slowly to a new core banking system because the integration issues aren't always there. And by the way, that integration challenge tends to be one of the biggest ones I've run across. I had a conversation about a month and a half ago with three very large institutions in Europe talking about modernization, and they said, the biggest challenge we have is how do we make the old stuff run with the new stuff at the same time. So they've chosen to modernize maybe a couple of functionalities, maybe move them to cloud, and yet they've got some applications, some workloads that for a number of reasons are still running on mainframe or an internal server farm. And the difficulty for them is how do we make this stuff run at the same time? The next one is digital banking. So the digital bank is really setting up a digital bank only or a twin. National Australia Bank, for example, years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, created a digital bank called UBank. They brought in a brand new core banking system for that UBank, so a limited number of customers, digital only. And then as that core implementation took off and succeeded, they started moving their legacy customers. I don't like the word legacy, but they moved their traditional customers over to that brand new core that was only running the digital bank, and now it's running the entire bank. So again, that approach tends to be popular with institutions who are okay building a brand new brand, maybe like National Australia did with UBank, or they're looking at this as a way to minimize the risk as well, moving over a couple of customers. The key here really comes down to, do you want to maintain that brand even after the modernization is done? Are you going to continue to run 2 different banks, or is it strictly a placeholder? And then finally, the one I think is used more often than not, particularly by the mid to large institutions, and that's digital transformation. It's kind of hard to come up with this, where you're actually setting up a strategy that looks at business functionality on a case-by-case basis, and then depending on the number of criteria that you're using to judge, which ones do you modernize first? Do they need to be modernized first of all? Which do you modernize first based on, again, a number of criteria that I'll show you in a second, whether it's security or functionality or and here it's really interesting because I've seen banks take 2 kinds of approaches. The first being, where am I going to get the most bang for the buck, right? Where am I going to see the biggest return based on that modernization of this particular workload? And the other tack is kind of on the opposite side of the spectrum that says, where do I have the least risk, right? So maybe a very minor functionality. If it fails, that's okay. We can kind of either move back to the old version or we can fix the new version. So that's an entire spectrum. But the point here is you're moving over workloads as they become apt to either modernize, move to a different platform, or even give to a third-party partner. KYC compliance would be one of those instances where if you're running it on-prem today, maybe you want to give that to a managed services provider to do for you. And again, this is a very simplistic way of looking at modernization. And my bet is, as an institution, you're going to pick, kind of a hybrid maybe of, well, we'll do big bank except for lending. Maybe we'll do lending. We'll keep lending where it is and look at lending later on. But these are the three major components of modernization. Next slide, Chuck. So, I mentioned that banks are going to look at individual functionality, individual workloads, and then based on the number of criteria, they're going to decide what do we modernize, what do we move, what do we give away to a third-party partner, or something in between. And so this is from last year's cloud survey. And from what I understand, this year's cloud survey is actually coming out next week. So I'm going to have brand new numbers. I get a feeling this is going to remain the same, though, or very close to it. The number one factor here you see for the factors that they use to determine which applications or workloads to migrate to cloud, which to keep on premise. First one, clearly security. This has always been the case. And security here means a number of things. It could be cybersecurity, it could be fraud, it could be denial of service, ransomware, access to data breach, privacy, for example. But that's still the number one concern or the number one factor that banks look at when they're determining what to do with a particular workload. The complexity to migrate, again, I mentioned that before. What are the integration issues if we migrate this? What are the other dependencies and so forth? The cost of running it in cloud, the technical expertise. Again, I won't read through all of these, but these are really the important factors that institutions look at. And this is global. So we do have a breakout by region, by geography, by large bank versus small bank, for example. But globally speaking, across retail, I talked earlier about AI and analytics. This is really important because once you've determined your approach, once you determine the kinds of workloads that you want to move or modernize or give to a third-party partner, you have to think about the data. You have to think about the use of that data in AI-based analytics. And here we ask the question of what are the primary reasons you're using AI? And by the way, I'll mention the definition of how we look at AI in a second here, but improving risk management, improving customer experience. We talked about how important that is. So if you look at the top answers, they're pretty close, between 41 and 46% shows these as one of their top three: increasing the product quality of the products or the services, increasing employee productivity. That one never showed up prior to 2020, but clearly, since we're talking about hybrid and remote work now, that's become incredibly important. Accelerate innovation. I talked about the importance of innovation before, along with customer experience, and then increasing competitiveness. So these are the areas where the banks are really thinking about using AI for their projects and initiatives. You know, it's one thing I mentioned before. It's one thing to say you want to do this, but the data management issues become huge. Next slide. So where are they using AI and analytics? Well, certainly on the front end, if we look at the front office, they're using it for the customer interfaces, and this tends to be probably the easiest place to implement AI. So that's for chat, that's for natural language processing, biometrics, for authentication, and so forth. It's amazing how far we've come with this particular area of AI. I don't know how many of you use Clear at the airports, but I love Clear. I mean, it just takes a picture of your face and you've gone right through TSA. It's fantastic. I love it. The next area is around automation. This is huge. You know, I talked about that move to digital infrastructure and how do you manage that beast, that complex beast that we now call the digital infrastructure that's outside of your own data center. And that's where automation plays a huge role, whether it's business operations, for example, lending origination, deposit origination, card origination, or IT operations. I was on a panel, in fact, with IBM this time last year. And one of the largest payments providers in payments processors in the US said that they had pretty much every workload instrumented so that if something failed, they could tell right away where it failed and then automate the process of remediation. And yet there was a large regional bank on that same panel that said, no, we're scared to death. Because again, if somebody calls us and said we had a problem with, you know, with either a customer lag time or something else, it would take us hours to figure out just where the failure was, much less remediated. So the use of AI in IT operations is increased in importance. And then finally, AI-driven analytics, and that's a number of different areas. We've always talked about customer 360, recommendation engines. Here we're talking about risk management as well. Pricing and profitability has become important as well. And because we're moving toward that, you know, that first bullet and the third bullet kind of go hand in hand, depending on the customer, the relationship. Are they both small business and retail? How long have they been with the institution? What's the average deposit size? All of that knowledge around the customer will drive pricing, profitability, bundled services, and so forth. And then finally, fraud detection and prevention, which is right now the single biggest use and challenge with AI-based analytics is around fraud detection because of false positives. I know we've gotten pretty good at stopping the transactions. We've not gotten so good at determining, well, this is not really a fraudulent transaction. It's actually a good customer. Now, to give you an indication for how important this is, although the absolute spend numbers are smaller than, let's say, security, the spending on AI, the growth in that spending is higher than any other technology within banking. Right now, the spend on AI globally is growing at 23 to 26% per year through 2025. Now, again, the absolute number is smaller, but the growth rate of that number is getting larger and larger, which means by 2025, it will be consuming a larger share of wallet, if you will, among all IT spend within the institution. Next slide, Chuck. I want to make sure I'm going to cover these in the time allowed. So which of the following business processes have you used AI in the last 12 months? Again, I mentioned security, and this goes to part of that fraud issue. It goes to cybersecurity. It's interesting, you know, when we talk to folks about where they're using cloud, for example, for where they're using cloud, one of the biggest areas where they're using cloud is in cybersecurity protection. And so that clearly is very, very important. IT operations, I mentioned before, how do you maintain resiliency and scalability? How do you keep track of what's happening in that digital infrastructure? Fraud and risk management, I talked about. Finance and accounting, it's interesting, you know, as financial insights research analysts, we don't cover finance per se, we don't cover accounts payable, accounts receivable, but I have noticed, and I worked in partnership with some of the other IDC analysts here, finance modernization has really taken off over the last 12 months. So we've been working with a number of vendors and institutions as well around finance modernization and whether or not to move to cloud, or where's the data, or what kind of analytics should we run against that workload. Customer service and support. So again, I won't read through all of these, but these are the areas where the institutions globally are using AI. Next slide. But there are challenges. So the degree of difficulty to deploying, we talked about fraud operations, and this chart shows either very difficult or difficult. Again, it's self-reported by institutions. Fraud operations, and again, I think that's the false positives. That's how do I prevent my good customers from conducting transactions if they've traveled? It's interesting. I mentioned I've been traveling a lot lately. I carry two cards, a Business American Express card, and then I carry my own bank's card. And it's a small, I think they're about a 10 or $11 billion bank here in Massachusetts, community bank. My American Express card, they know that I travel a lot, so they never prevent me from doing anything when I'm abroad. My bank, however, I have to call them before every trip, even if I'm going to California, and say, by the way, I'm going to be in LA for a couple of days. Make sure that my card works, even my small business card with my bank. So there's still a lot of work to be done there in terms of using AI to say, hey, Jerry travels a lot. Maybe this is him. Let's not stop it for now if it's a small transaction and so forth. Loan portfolio optimization and risk management is another area where they're looking at that. Account opening fraud. Fraud is taking a huge leap in importance as well. You see cybersecurity here, financial risk, line of business operations automation. I talked about that as well. So again, these are the numbers where they're finding it difficult to deploy and manage AI. And there are a number of reasons for this. I forget whether I have a slide here, but for example, again, I mentioned the skill sets. Banks are saying that they don't understand which algorithms they should use. Particularly in the credit space, they're worried about biased AI models and the explainability of AI models. We have already seen the European Union and the FTC here warn against biased AI models in terms of credit decisioning, particularly if you're using things like social data and so forth. So there are still a number of challenges we have to overcome before we can manage or before we can successfully deploy AI. Next slide. But having said that, if you can overcome the challenges, this was really eye-opening for me. For those institutions that have used AI in whatever area, whether it was analytics or operations automation or front office chatbot and so forth, what did you expect to receive as a benefit, and where did you actually see the benefit? And here, other than the low cost and higher value, the actual real benefits far exceeded the expected benefits, which is really, I mean, if you're an institution looking at this and you've been kind of hemming and hawing about whether you should do something, this should give you an indication that there are real benefits not only to be had, but to be exceeded over what you think you might get from it. Improved IT efficiencies. I mentioned IT operations. If you can have an AI bot constantly searching your network and your digital infrastructure for points of problems, you can get ahead of it and remediate or ameliorate before they actually become problems. Same with business efficiencies. If you automate the lending, the mortgage origination process, you're going to see a lot of benefits there in terms of staff productivity, customer experience and satisfaction increases if you can give them an answer on the mortgage within 3 days instead of 3 weeks, frankly. So that improves, you lower your business risk, you improve your revenue growth, improving innovation, improving the staff experience. Staff often goes unnoticed, but when you're doing all of this, it actually does make the staff happier. It makes them more productive. They feel they're working on smarter tasks instead of just by rote going through the process. The only area where the real benefits, so where the real benefits was less than the expected benefits, was lower cost, higher value. And I think that's still a lack of education. I think that was, goes back to the previous slide where we talked about the challenges. Maybe they didn't understand, to what extent AI required that care and feeding, what the internal staff had to look like, their reliance on partnerships and so forth. But I think that'll equalize over time as well as we get more and more mature on the benefits and deployment models for AI. Next slide. So I think this is my summary slide. I mentioned the answers at the very beginning. Transformation to that digital infrastructure. The goal here is customer satisfaction, efficiency, innovation, and they all go hand in hand. All of those things will benefit from transforming to that digital infrastructure. It's not something you do overnight. It's, along with core modernization has to fit into that longer term strategy of what does my digital infrastructure look like? What do I keep on-prem? What do I send to a cloud provider? What do I get a third-party provider for? What functionality can I drive out to the edge? Because that has its own benefits as well. What do my network providers look like? What's the security and privacy? And then, given all of that, what does my internal support structure look like, both from an IT perspective as well as from a governance perspective? So, that digital infrastructure, again, it goes to expansion of the entire operating platform, the entire operating environment, including the mainframe, that transformative mainframe, including the cloud providers, including the edge and everything in between. The workload transformation has to be done on a case-by-case basis, unless, again, you're one of those smaller institutions that get everything from a managed services provider. However, having said that, even then, it's incumbent on you to look at the strategy, the longer-term roadmap and strategy from those managed services providers, and ask yourself, are they leading me? Are they taking me toward that path to a digital infrastructure as well? So even if you want to give everything to one or two providers, you still have to think about their strategy. What are they running? What's their resiliency and scalability plans look like? Where's the data sitting? What kind of analytics support can they provide me there as well? So it all comes down to that case-by-case business of transformation by business functionality. You have to let the business functionality drive everything. And then as part of that, AI and analytics and data management, all of those kind of go hand in hand. They become an absolutely critical component of transformation. As you're thinking about what to transform, you really do have to think about, where does the data sit? Where's the analytics going to reside? How critical is that to me, either from a privacy perspective, a security perspective, real-time perspective? I cover banking, but in the world of trading, for example, a picosecond means something. A nanosecond means something. And so that real-time aspect, particularly as we're moving the core to a real-time transformative process, that where that data sits and what the risks are in terms of moving that data, or any kind of lag or latency in that data, that's going to matter going forward. So all of this, all of these criteria, all of this acknowledgement of the digital infrastructure is really going to determine the approaches, your long-term strategy, and where those workloads are going to reside going forward. So I think, Chuck, that does it for me. I think the next slide
Okay,
is just the wrap up.
Jerry, thank you for that. That's really interesting to me, in terms of the focus really on customer satisfaction ahead of the normal, cost takeout, obviously innovation. Really interesting how all that ties together. And even interesting from a skill standpoint, with AI, those kinds of things. So let's pause here to see what questions are in the chat for Jerry.
Yeah, thanks, Chuck. By the way, one of the things I failed to mention, one of the other reasons that banks just want to move toward this whole transformative modernization is, and I should have mentioned this, is the fintechs. Ever since 2010, in certain areas, the fintechs have just been eating their lunch, if you will. Whether that was in lending, you see Rocket Mortgage, their commercials actually say we can give you an answer in hours. Banks can't compete with that. And now we're talking about the payment world as well. A lot of smaller payments providers. Buy now, pay later is a great example of the fintech world really coming into the banking space, saying, hey, we can do this better. And now the banks are kind of struggling to catch up. And one of the problems is, unless you move to that digital infrastructure, unless you modernize the core and take advantage of each of those platforms to do what they do best, you're going to lose that space as well. And there are a number of other areas we can go into. Banking as a service is something that we're writing about right now. Embedded finance, and how the financial services industry plays into the industry ecosystems, how we're working with non-financial services to partner up to create better customer experiences, even outside of strictly financial services. So that digital infrastructure, that openness, that agility and resilience and scalability really enable the institutions to do a whole lot more than they're doing today.
Okay, thank you. So in 1 second, we'll turn to a couple questions that are in the chat for Jerry. It's important during these webinars to leverage the live component and access to the subject matter expertise. But I would like to encourage everybody, if you do want more information around these critical topics of core modernization, you can reach out to Jerry directly. He's got a lot of material that him and IDC put out there. So let me pause, have someone read a couple questions in the chat, and then we'll go to Bala next to really talk about an exciting case study around Zafin, and how I'm really fascinated by the modernized product pricing, fees, offers, rewards presented by Zafin. So let's see if there's a couple questions in the chat that we can get Jerry to become aware of and then answer. So if somebody could read those.
Before we do that, I did have something I wanted to get Jerry's thoughts on, since he brought it up towards the tail end. Jerry, you spoke a little bit around bank as a service, and I'm also seeing incredible uptake on embedded finance, bank as a service, these type of topics. So if you don't mind sharing your perspective on
Sure.
those topics.
So
I know they're very big and broad, but
yeah, no. In fact, my entire team is writing a series of reports. Hopefully, they'll be published at the beginning of July around embedded finance, depending on whether it's lending, whether it's even capital markets, trading, and investment banking, for example, or payments or customer experience. So in my mind, there is this natural progression or evolution between what we used to call open banking, which some people are still talking about open banking, and for me, open banking really meant, how do I modernize the infrastructure again, to be open, to use open APIs, to use microservices and so forth, and allow for both internal development of new products and services. So again, whether you call it low code, no code, or something else, have business analysts developing products through the use of libraries. And then you talk about banking as a service, which a number of banks have gone to. Greenpoint, for example. And I forget whether they are the bank that Uber uses. So Uber, for example, provides their drivers a deposit account and a debit card, and I believe lending as well, or they soon will. Now, Uber is not a bank, but they're using a banking as a service, to provide those services to its drivers. So that's the next step in the evolution, is to provide banking. And another great company is Solaris out of Berlin. Solaris is an entire banking infrastructure with a banking license, but they don't have direct customers. So they want the fintechs to come in and use their infrastructure, use their compliance and security. And then, if I want to provide a prepaid card, I can go to Solaris and say, you give me all the compliance, all the security, all the data and analytics that I need. I'll be the one to issue the card to the customers. I'll be the primary contact point, and so forth. So that's kind of banking as a service. And then we're talking about embedded finance. That goes a level deeper. So that now becomes, well, I guess Uber is kind of the embedded finance model as well. So that's, again, whether you're an institution that's currently still driving traditional products and services as well as doing embedded finance, or whether you're a fintech that happens to have a banking license and all you're doing is embedded finance in different areas. The final stage, and I kind of mentioned this in passing, at IDC, we've created this program called Future of Industry Ecosystems. And this is where every industry talks to other industries on behalf of a customer journey. Now, the best way I can think of to describe this is, back in 2016, there was a flood in Louisiana. And there was a bank that held a lot of mortgages for the affected homes. So the CEO said, what's our exposure? What's our mortgage exposure for those homes that are underwater? So they came up with some number. But then someone in IT said, there's a geospatial company on the West Coast that has satellite imagery, so we can actually tell which homes are completely underwater that we hold the mortgages on, and which ones are just damaged. And so by getting that information, by working with a non-financial industry, they were able to get to a much better number. Then they were able to turn around and talk to their customers and say, we understand your home is underwater, let's hold off on the mortgage payment. Or for those homes that, and here I'm taking it even a step further, for those homes that were damaged, they could have said, by the way, I'm going to give you an equity line at a lower percentage rate just so you can rebuild your home. And then they could have gone to a home building company, a Home Depot or a Lowe's, and struck a deal with that non-financial industry to say, hey, we have a certain subsegment of customers. Can you give them a credit card at a lower rate? So you've got all of these different industries working together on behalf of the customer journey. So that's the future of industry ecosystems. So we go from open banking to banking as a service to embedding the finance all the way out to industry ecosystems. So that's kind of how we're looking at that whole evolution.
That's actually incredibly interesting, because the perspective that we see at Zafin is also exactly in line with that, where products evolve into packages, and packages go from being purely financial packages to financial plus non-financial, and then that broadens into other industries as well. So it's fascinating to hear you say that. Do you see that across the world as well?
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, right now we're still at the very beginning of that industry ecosystem. So there are a number of things. They're not even case studies anymore. They're fully production. For example, BNY Mellon developed an open API platform called Nexen a while ago, and it consists of being able to access trading data, like petabytes of trading data. And I believe it's the Arizona Retirement or Pension Fund. So it's a government industry now, is using Nexen to do advisory services for their retirees. So there are production examples like that worldwide.
Okay, so now at this point in time, I'd like to thank Jerry, and again emphasize you can reach out to him directly if you'd like to have more involvement with IDC. And having said that, I'd now like to introduce Bala. Bala is the CTO of Zafin, which is a really cool company I've been working for. I'm absolutely fascinated how product and pricing fits into these tenets that Jerry laid down. So Bala will take us through what is Zafin, Zafin's experience with modernization and modernization opportunity across different types of bank. And then we'll open it up for questions for Bala. So Bala, it's yours for a little while here.
Thanks, Chuck. And once again, thanks, Jerry. It was incredibly informative listening to you, and I always enjoy listening to you. So I'm going to draw upon a fair amount of what Jerry spoke about in terms of the trends and what he's seeing in the financial institutions, and then weave that into who we are and what we do. So as Chuck asked, who's Zafin? So Zafin is a cloud-based SaaS company that is deeply focused on product, banking and other products and packages like we just briefly discussed about, its pricing and functions related to products such as offer management, rewards, fees, rates, and so forth. That's what Zafin does. We tend to externalize banking products and those related functions of pricing and offers and so forth. We externalize those from the core systems for exactly the reasons that Jerry talked about. So as banks look to modernize their core systems, a pathway that Jerry talked about, which we call as modular modernization, involves taking some of these functions of product and pricing, and at Zafin we externalize them into a cloud, and we tie back those cloud-based systems where we've externalized back into the core systems that the bank runs, and enable modernization to happen at scale, but also to happen progressively and in a modular way. Now, what we have externalized in terms of product and pricing have the attributes that Jerry talked about. And he mentioned at one point around having these composable pricing structures and product structures. That's exactly what we do at Zafin. We allow for business analysts or for even the business users to go in, create, define products. And product isn't just a banking product. It can also be a package. So it can be a marketing person at a bank defining a package, working with the BA or with the line of business execs. And those products need not be in any one particular line of business. They can actually span multiple lines of businesses, such as cards and deposit products or lending and other products. And Jerry talked about the ability to price these becomes important as you look at modular solutions. That's what we do. We look at the totality of the relationship that this customer may have with the financial institution and allow to make very intelligent pricing decisions based on the totality of that relationship. So those are some of the things that Zafin does at a high level. And in doing that, we also provide the ability to combine financial and non-financial packages. So for example, a package could be a set of banking products, but it can also include a Netflix subscription and so forth. So you can package financial, non-financial packages, and we can do that not just for the retail, but also for the commercial side of the bank. Jerry spoke at length about some of the AI benefits, and in particular, he talked about innovation and business efficiencies that drive this, and that's precisely what we have seen. So in our commercial side, we embed analytics as well to allow for the type of benefits that Jerry talked about to happen. So I know it was a long-winded answer, Chuck, but happy to take it anywhere else you want me to.
Bala, so I think what we'll do here is I will mention that on July 11th, Bala and I will get into a lot more detail on the specifics of a really directed case study and set of use cases around Zafin, which again, I find as a really fascinating first mover use case around core modernization, because it combines everything Jerry talked about customer satisfaction and innovation and really differentiation. And I'm starting to see the importance of it. Just yesterday, I personally got a mailer from a local bank that is not now starting to offer 11 different products that have nothing to do with banking as part of a bank. So I'm really starting to see the combination of what Jerry was talking about. And by the way, I was very satisfied to see that. I've always been disappointed in a lot of the dry offers I've gotten from my banks, but I'm really getting more intrigued by some of these offers. So I think this case study will present on July 11th, where Bala and I will go deeper into the how, is something I would encourage everybody to sign up for and attend. And so then just a recap of things, I think, from an IBM systems standpoint, the mainframe is, the IBM Z, which is my wheelhouse, and my specialty is really core banking and the ancillary products around that, and also payments. We're very well positioned for the highest levels of security, performance, availability, really cloud through our Red Hat offerings, and AI through our new Z16 Telum chip. I'd like to encourage everybody to sign up for that Part 2 webinar, but having said that, I'll start to move to, look at the questions, but I would like to remind everybody, a replay of this webinar is definitely going to be made available to you. Jerry's charts will be made available to you. In terms of next steps, I would like to talk about this for a second. Beyond the next webinar, which is on July 12th, sorry about that, Tuesday, July 12th from 11 to 12, we would like to offer everybody a ability to reach out for us, to get in touch, to have a 60-minute consultation between Bala's team and my team. And to accomplish that, you can send an email to inquiries@zafin.com. And remember, this is a really good case study or use case for progressive modernization. I'd like to encourage everybody also, if you're thinking about core modernizations, or you're thinking about payments or digital infrastructure in general, reach out to Jerry direct, and you have his contact information in the front. So let me do one more thing before we close the webinar. Let's just double check to see if there's any questions that anybody would like to ask now, or that are in the chat that we didn't get to. We've covered how you can get the replay. We've covered the next webinar. We've covered how you can get the charts, and we've covered the next steps, which is I'd encourage you to take us up on our offer of a complimentary consultation, or if you just have some email questions you want to send us, that's fine as well. One more check, any questions available in the chat or that anybody would like to ask? Okay, going once, going twice, going 3 times. So if I could, we could move to end the webinar. That would be fantastic.